Off air. Ah, yes. Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good afternoon, somewhere in the world. Welcome to the 12th episode of Google Developer Experts SSA on air. And today we have a special episode and a lot of guests. So we're here to share with you all the cool stuff from IO. And we have different topics ranging from Android to machine learning, some web technology stuff. So we're here today to talk to you about all this kind of things. So we normally host this show once a month, and last month was about the state of progressive web apps. So if you would like to catch up with those, please check out the show notes for the link to the playlist, and you can still watch those shows. So without further ado, let's just get started. So today in the call, we have a lot of guests. We have Alex from Luno and GDG Cape Town. We have Dale Humbly, Cloud GDE from Cape Town also. We have Josh Libison from GDG Johannesburg. We have Kenneth Kinyanjui, Progressive Web App, Cloud GDE from Kenya. We have Mike Duzer, Web Technologies GDE from South Africa. And we have Mustafa, a very unusual guest from another region. So Mustafa is originally from India, but currently based in Ottawa. And then we have Nick from GDG Cape Town, Rebecca Franks from GDG Cape Johannesburg. And then we have Vivian from Google and me, Dario Mungoi, Andre GDE from Mozambique, currently based in Ottawa. So as I said, this show is going to be focused on doing a recap of I/O. And without further ado, I'll just pass it on to Alex to start with app bundles.
Awesome. Thank you, Dario. Good job on the intro. I don't think we've had this many people on the show in a long time. Okay, app bundles. I'm definitely excited about this. In fact, I think this might be my overall highlight from IO 18. Why, you might ask? Well, if we move over to the next slide, I'll talk about two of the reasons that I think really make this an exciting thing. So first of all, it helps reduce the size of your Android apps. So users don't have to use as much data when downloading your app. There have been quite a few studies showing that the effect of app size has on downloads, and the numbers aren't pretty at all. So basically, the bigger your app is, the less likely users are to download it. This problem is particularly acute in developing regions like Africa. So helping devs reduce the size of their apps has been an interest of mine for quite a while. And now we have an important new tool in that fight. We've seen app sizes being reduced in the range of sort of 15% to 50% and beyond with Android app bundles. You can expect to see a size saving of about 1% for every 6 megabytes of your APK file currently. But that will vary quite a bit depending on how you use different aspects of Android's build system. Okay, so that's the first reason. It reduces the size of your app. Fantastic. The other reason I love Android app bundles is because it's really easy to implement. You can get started getting your apps bundled in about 10 minutes, and there's a good code lab to guide you through it as well. We often see big announcements at I/O and even bigger investments of your time over the next year trying to figure out how to actually do it. So app bundles are amazing. You can just get them going and they will reduce the size of your apps and your people will love you. Another little bonus on the side, if you've been managing multiple APK splits, I do sympathize with you, and you'll be happy to know that it's no longer something you have to worry about. Google Play will effectively handle that for you. So Rebecca, if we can move on to the next slide. So what are Android app bundles and how does it work? Well, it's a new upload format for Android apps that contains all of your compiled code and resources, but differs APK generation and signing to when it's on Google Play. So in some regards, it's not that different from APK. It's a bundle of all of your app resources and code, just with a little bit of extra metadata in there. Where things get a little bit different is how Google Play actually serves your app to users now. Instead of just giving everybody who tries to download your app the full APK, of resources for all screen sizes, strings for all languages, and native libraries for all the different architectures, Google Play now takes your bundle and builds slimmer APKs just for the type of device that is requesting it. So the APK the user downloads only contains the resources, strings, and native libraries that that device needs. Next, please. So let's have a closer look at what an app bundle looks like and how these APKs get generated. So as we can see here, inside of your app bundle, you have all of your DEX files, resources, etc. for all the languages and screen densities. So Google Play then uses APK splits technology, which was introduced in Android Lollipop, to create APK splits of every possible combination of resource density bucket, language, and native architecture. This includes a base split that contains all of your compiled code or DEX files. So this is all happening on the Google Play services. You don't really need to worry about this. This is just how it works behind the scenes. You only have to generate and upload a single Android app bundle file. If we move over to the next slide, we'll see that this is what actually happens when someone requests the APK. So when a specific device requests a download from Google Play, the required APK splits are then merged into a final APK that's just the right fit for that device. The example on this slide shows a device with an XXX DPI density, an ARM architecture, and English set as the only language on that device. These three splits are then added to the base split, which contains all of your DEX code, and these splits are all combined into a single APK that's just perfect for that device. Just a note here, to support devices from before Android Lollipop, instead of creating many APK splits that are later put together, Google Play just creates a matrix of APKs based on the device architecture and density. So instead of creating splits that are bundled together and added into one APK, it just goes ahead and creates all the variations of your possible APKs. This does not include variations for languages, however, because that would create a massive amount of APKs. So all languages are always included before Android Lollipop. This does mean that the space saving is a little bit less before Android L. So a common question is, what happens if I change the language on my device? Well, Play Services monitors for these changes in the background and then downloads the extra APK split just for that language in the background and applies it. I am quite interested to see how this works in practice, but I think it's a good approach that should work well. There are some configuration settings you can adjust for Android app bundles, which let you decide if you want to split on language, architecture, and density, which then you can pick exactly which splits you want to be generated for you, but the default options of all should be fine for most projects. So I'm going to hand over now to Mustafa, who's going to tell you a lot more about dynamic modules and how they're delivered. Thanks, Mustafa.
Thanks, Alex. I agree with Alex. I think the Android app bundles are probably the most exciting thing that were announced at I/O this year. So apart from the benefits that you get in terms of saving or reducing the size of your APK with the Android app bundles, another cool thing that you can do is you can deliver features of your app on demand. What does that mean? A lot of apps that we all build have features that only a small subset of our users actually use regularly. Think of it like, for example, you have an app that has this feature where you use the camera to scan the credit card number for a user. Now, the problem with that is, like, let's say only a few people use it. You include all the resources, all the native libraries, all the assets for that feature in your final APK, and every single user downloads it, irrespective of whether or not they use that feature. What if you could deliver that feature on demand for users who actually are interested in using that feature. Dynamic modules actually makes that possible for you. If you can move to the next slide, using Android app bundles, we can have multiple APKs for a single app. Now, what does that mean? So Alex already talked about the concept of a base APK, which has all the common code and assets and resources that an app needs. Now, using dynamic modules, we can create smaller APKs for individual features as well. Now, in this example, we have a base APK, and we have two feature APKs or dynamic modules for a feature to add a recipe or view something in VR. And each of these APK can have its own resources, source code, and also the native libraries. If you move on to the next slide, we can see how the Android app bundle basically bundles all these features into the actual AAB that is generated by Android Studio for you. Now, inside the app bundle, we have a directory for every feature, which has all the resources for that feature. Now, when this bundle is uploaded to Google Play, what it does, it reads the bundle and generates all those smaller feature APKs for you. When the user installs the app, what happens is the base APK is installed, and whenever the user navigates to the section in the app where this dynamic feature needs to be triggered, Google Play will download that APK, install it, and then navigate the user into that feature. This is super powerful because not every user needs to download all the extra code and resources that they don't care about. If we move to the next slide, so Google announced the Play core library to make this happen. So it's responsible for two things: installing the on-demand modules and then also managing those modules. So when, let's say, you want to launch a feature, when the user clicks a button in your app UI, you click on a button, the Play core library will prefetch that APK, feature APK for you, install it, and then it will give you callbacks to tell you that the download has started, it's in progress, and then it's finished. And then you can base it and also launch that activity for you. Another thing that you can do is, a common problem, especially in emerging markets, is that as the APK size increases on the device after a period of time and the users run out of memory on their device, they go into the settings section, look at all their apps and see how much data they are consuming, and then go and uninstall the apps that are occupying too much data. Now, you obviously don't want to be in that position where the user uninstalls your app just because it's consuming too much memory on their device. One of the cool things that you can do with dynamic modules is that you can detect that if a user is not using a feature very often, you can programmatically uninstall that module for them. So that way you can clear up the memory that you're consuming on the user's device for a feature that they are not actively using. And let's say the user changed their mind and then they come back and want to use the feature again, Google Play will anyways download and install that feature for them. So this is extremely powerful, especially in emerging markets where you have sub-$100 smartphones. Next slide, please. So how do you create these modules? It's pretty straightforward. You have this new template in Android Studio called dynamic module. So you can just start, do a file new dynamic module and follow the instructions to create one. It's very similar to a Gradle module, but all of this is basically wired together with a new Gradle module called dynamic modules that Google has introduced in the latest Android Studio beta. To know more, there is a good talk, if you move to the next slide, called The Future of Apps on Android and Google Play. I highly recommend everyone watching this talk. It has all the details that you may need, plus it also has information about some code labs that you can try out this feature with. Next slide, please. The other thing that I'm going to talk about today is Google Play releases. Building an app is difficult. Testing and releasing it is another thing altogether. easier to test the app with a large set of users before actually shipping it to production. If you move to the next slide, there are two main things that were announced. The first one is called Open Track in Google Play. What this is similar to the older beta track in Google Play, where you could allow beta users of your app to test the app. Now, some apps want to have a large number of users using the app because let's say you're building something that's going to be really popular, you need as many people testing it in the beta phase as possible. So there is an open track now. The difference between this and the older version is that apps installed inside apps released in this track are displayed as in a separate section in Google Play called open for testing or something like that. And then anybody can actually install these apps. Now, the thing about this is that you don't have to manage any of Google Groups or Google Plus communities or mailing lists or anything like that. Once you put it in there, and then all the users that are eligible to actually install apps through Google Play can actually install and give feedback. And another advantage of this is that all the ratings or like negative reviews that may come up are not associated with the actual production listing of your app. If you move to the next slide, the other one that Google announced that I'm personally very excited about is called the internal test track. Previously, if you had to use Google Play for alpha and beta releases, you had to upload your APK, wait for a few hours for Google to process the APK, and then your users or your testers can actually start testing the app. Obviously, this is a huge time sink because you have to wait, your testers have to wait a lot of time to actually be able to download and play with the app. So with the internal test track, they actually eliminated this issue. So if you move to the next slide, the difference between alpha beta track and the internal test track is that alpha beta tracks, you have to wait for the processing to happen before you can start using it. But with internal test track, the app is available immediately. You're still bound by the Play Store policy. So if you do something that violates that, you will be suspended. But this allows you to actually push something, let's say from your CI, and then your testers will immediately get an update and you can start testing the app. So that's about Google Play Services. I'll hand it off to Rebecca now to talk about Constraint Layout. Thanks.
Thanks, Mustafa. Yes, so my most exciting announcement from Google I/O was the announcement of Constraint Lab 2.0. So this wasn't really kept as such a secret, as the developers did have some pre-sessions at different conferences just talking about what they've released or what they plan to release with Constraint Lab 2. So there's a lot of new changes with Constraint Layout. Some of the interesting things that I'm not going to go into too much detail of is there's a whole bunch of new layouts that are now available for you to use with Constraint Layout 2. So things such as Flow, which is like a flexbox layout, which allows you to do things as soon as a bunch of views get bigger than the screen, it goes to the next row underneath it. There's also now the linear layout, which is linear layout, which is like linear layout, but it's part of Constraint Layout, which just makes your layout a little bit flatter than what it used to be. And then there's also a whole bunch of cool, interesting decorators that they demonstrated and very powerful things you can do with using decorators. So you can see below, I've got like a cute little lava decorator, which is basically just on these buttons, the decorator's been added and it does that cool animation effect of looking like lava. But more importantly, there were some really cool things such as they announced managing states. So if you've ever worked with any kind of app that needs to like show a different screen based on some kind of like state, maybe the state of a network or the state of some like user status or something like that, it's been typically pretty difficult and you've had to switch between these states manually yourself and like maybe load up a different constraint set, or maybe you've loaded up a whole completely new layout. So with Constraint Layouts 2.0, there is now this concept of a state, and you can have all your sort of same view logic in one view, and you just switch between these different states. So really powerful and pretty simple. The next really awesome thing that they spoke about in the Constraint Layout talk that I'm really, really excited about is motion layouts. So motion layout gives you really, really interesting animations. And for someone like me who really battled to do animations before on Android, this is like really an easy way to get started with it. So here's an example from the Constraint Lab talk of what you can achieve using motion layout. So basically, with motion layout, you just create 2 different layouts, and you can create like what we call keyframes between these, and Constraint Lab will automatically know how to animate between those 2. So it's really, really powerful, but the even more powerful part is that they're working on a motion editor. So you can see here, this is within Android Studio, and we've got like a timeline at the bottom, and you are able to like say where your icon should be at a certain point in time and add different keyframe animations to certain elements in your view. So this isn't released just yet. Constraint Lab 2 is still coming. It's not officially public yet, but I suspect it should be out in the next few weeks or so. And there'll be lots of these cool new features. There's a lot more to it as well. And I would highly suggest watching this Constraint Lab talk where they go through in depth all the different features that they've announced for Constraint Lab 2 and talk a little bit about that motion editor. So it's a very, very good talk, and it was possibly my favorite one from the conference. And now I'll hand over to Josh, who will talk about AR, VR, and machine learning.
Cool. Thanks, Rebecca. The motion layout looks awesome. Can't wait to try it. So I'm going to talk about AR, VR, and machine learning. There's not that much VR, but I'm not going to go into depth about these topics, but hopefully it will get everyone watching interested and excited about them. Okay, next slide. Rebecca, next slide. Thank you. All right, so the first really interesting announcement at Google I/O was cloud anchors. And what cloud anchors are a way to share augmented reality experiences. And it uses AR Core or AR Kit, depending on the platform that you use it on. And so it works on Android and iOS, which is quite cool. And it's an SDK that's available for Unity, Unreal, Android NDK. You can also use an iOS with an AR Core, AR Kit interface. And how it works is that it renders 3D objects attached to anchors. And these anchors allow these objects to be seen on multiple devices at the same time. So all users connected to the same session will then be able to see that object, but from the perspective of their own device, which is really cool. And it uses Firebase to share the information, if you're wondering. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of you have probably seen this already from the keynote, but there are some really cool applications of this technology. So games you can play in real time in a shared space. Okay, next slide. Another cool announcement was augmented images. And this allows you to turn 2D images into 3D images just by pointing your phone at them. So it's using Google's new vertical plane detection. So it can not only detect horizontal planes, now it can also detect vertical planes. And you provided a set of reference images. And once you add these images to your database, it will track those images in the real world. And once you've got a hook on that tracked image, you can then substitute your own 3D experience into that image. So as you can see in the animation, you can do some really cool stuff. So you can really bring 2D images to life. So if it's on a poster in a subway or a movie poster, you can really create some cool things. Okay, next slide. Another one I really enjoyed was the Google Maps platform for games. And what this allows you to do is use the Google Maps APIs to build real-world experiences in your game. So it actually uses 3D objects from Google Maps, and you can use them in your games. So there's over 100 million 3D objects or something, and they update these things daily. And another cool thing is it's optimized for mobile, so it loads them dynamically, so you won't run out of memory, etc. on mobile devices. So you could use it in VR as well, which is really resource constrained. So these game objects include buildings, roads, landmarks, that kind of thing. And what Google has done is that they've taken all these objects and they've turned them to actual game objects that you can use inside of Unity. So this allows you to texture them, customize the colors, the sizes, whatever you want. Like you can see in the animation, you can theme your whole scene in Unity, and it looks to be really powerful. So there's also another a very cool thing that they've done as well. They've defined player-friendly areas. So you can't have people wandering around into strange areas, like into the woods or whatever. They've defined areas that are safe for players to play in. So if you're building an augmented reality experience, then this would be perfect. Only downside of this is that it's not available to the general public yet. If you're a game dev, you can contact Google and they will get in touch with you. So hopefully this will be available to the general public soon. Cool. Next slide. Moving into the machine learning stuff, a very cool announcement was MLKit. And what this is a mobile SDK for machine learning. Again, works on Android and iOS. So covering all bases there. And it provides to you a multitude of machine learning detection, and classification, image labeling, as you can see there. So this is the sample app. I was playing around with it. The first one you can see there's barcode detection. Second one is there's a funny sign. It's actually behind me. I don't know if you can see it. There it is. And that's detecting text in that image, and it's quite a messy image, and it's finding all of those words pretty effectively. And there's face detection and also label detection, a little toy from Google I/O. There he is. So very, very powerful. It uses TensorFlow Lite, and you can actually upload your own TensorFlow Lite models. So if you have custom machine learning tasks that you want to perform, you can upload your own TensorFlow Lite models, and it's integrated very tightly with Firebase, which makes it pretty cool. It's also offline and online. So if you want to detect stuff offline, you can. The detection won't be as strong as you would have doing it online. But if you say wanted to detect a dog, and then you want to determine what type of dog, you could then send that to the cloud and then identify what type of dog it is. Okay, next slide. And these are coming soon to MLKit. So there's face contours, which was demoed at Google I/O, and that detects up to 100 points at 60 frames per second. Looks to be very cool. And another one is smart reply. So this provides you context-specific suggestions on device. And it's the same tech that Google uses in its other products, and that should be available to the general public at some point. Okay, next slide. And lastly, there was a dominant theme at Google I/O, and that was machine learning in medicine. And a lot of these advances in medical analysis are powered by TensorFlow. And it's because of its open source nature, it's made a lot of these advances possible. And in combination with cloud TPUs, Google that and have a look at that if you're interested in graphics cards or anything like that. They've been able to do this. So this is one example, which is trying to detect cardiovascular problems, so heart disease from retinal images. And it factors that are part of this prediction are age, gender, smoking status, blood pressure. And it's claimed that prediction, they can predict this within the next 5 years if you're going to suffer from heart disease in any sort of way. So very cool. And it also could be used as a biomarker, so another form of identification. Another interesting area is also to monitor diabetes. So one of the examples was to take pictures of different foods and load them up to the cloud before you eat them, and then they use machine learning to identify what food that was. And if they're monitoring your insulin, then they can see what kind of spike you get from eating those foods. So then they can see how people react to different foods. So if you eat a banana, I have a different reaction to someone else who eats a banana. So that sort of thing. So very interesting stuff. And And I'd recommend you have a look at these just out of interest. There's one talk that gives a broad overview of all this stuff. It doesn't go too deep into the deep learning area. But yeah, those were my highlights. So next up, we have Nick Rout, and he's going to be telling us all about material design.
Thanks, Josh. That was really, really interesting. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about what was announced for material design at Google I/O. And there was a lot this time around. It was pretty exciting for me. Prior to Google I/O, there was a sort of rumor that there would be a material design 2.0 update announced. And although it wasn't officially called that, I really think Google delivered on this front. So next slide, please. Cool. So some of the overall goals that the material design team communicated were to provide a bit more flexibility and expressiveness for your brand, perhaps your company, through material theming. So I think this can be seen as sort of opening up material design to fit around your brand and whatever your sort of personality that your business incorporates. They still wanted to maintain the core material metaphors though, so those are all there. They introduced a whole suite of new research-backed guidelines and UI components, a lot of tools for designers to mock and showcase screens, and then on the flip side of that, a lot of open source components for Android, iOS, web, and Flutter. And I think really the overall goal here is to make the design to develop process a lot more seamless. You can see all of this cool new stuff on their updated website, which is material.io, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of them now. So next slide, please. Cool. So flexibility and expressiveness with material theming. Previously, I think material design was viewed, well, I don't think it was designed this way intentionally, but it was perhaps viewed as quite restrictive, and some Android apps, due to being very similar, could be seen as perhaps boring, or there was no real individuality here. So Google's opened up a bit of the material design metaphors with things like more system icon styles, and not just the filled material icon style. They've got some line styles, they've got multiple colors, they've got rounded corners, things like that. They've opened up with more shape types. So if you perhaps are using a card view in your Android app, you no longer have to just have the 2DP rounded corners. You could have something like chamfered edges or a higher radius corner. There's a wider range of color palettes. So there was that sort of fixed material design color palette that exists before, but now this is opening it up to any color palette and allowing you to generate a sort of a light to dark color palette based on whatever your brand uses. And of course, as usual, they're embracing typography, but really this time they're emphasizing it with a variety of different styles. Next slide, please. Cool. So in terms of actually using these material design components, they've introduced a lot of new and updated components to the entire spec. So for example, you can see in that GIF there that the new proposal for a text field, which looks a bit different to the previous one. What we heard at Google I/O is that extensive research went into how these things look and behave, which is really cool. This text field in particular, we heard, went through 140 variations, which they user tested with real people, and eventually they landed on these two variations, which should ideally give you the most intuitive user experience. A bunch of other components were announced that weren't there before. Things like the extended fab are quite interesting. And these will be continuously updated on their website, so be sure to check that out. Next slide, please. Cool. So for designers, and if you're a developer who likes to dabble with design stuff, there's a lot of new tools available for you to use to basically go up to that point where you're going to be writing the code for your layouts or your classes and so forth. So first up, there's this material theme editor, which is actually a Sketch plugin that Google developed. What it allows you to do is use all of these stock material design components and create this entire, basically like a sticker sheet for your entire brand so that you have these reusable components that you can build screens from directly in Sketch. It's really cool. There's a great code lab on it, and it makes building things and mocking up screens very easy in Sketch. There is an improved icon exporter. So previously there was the material.io /icons, I believe, which is a sort of browser for all the material icons where you can export them in various formats. That's been much improved to include those new styles I mentioned previously. And you can really like tweak all the aspects of them, colors, shape, style, before exporting them. There's a new color tool. So you can go ahead and insert your brand color tool or your base brand color tools into this color tool on the website. And it'll generate a whole palette for you to use in your app. And also do cool things like suggest text colors based on accessibility. Lastly, and this is a very cool one, there's the material gallery, which is quite similar to if you've used something like Zeppelin or Envision, where it's almost a preview for the screens that you've mocked up. The nice thing here is that, well, it's entirely free. And also, if you are using the Material Theme Editor Sketch plugin, you can upload your screens directly from Sketch to the gallery. There's no like in-between step. It all works within Sketch, which is pretty awesome. And then when you're actually viewing on the gallery, if you happen to be using the Material Theme Editor, you can hover over some components that your designer might have put into screens, and it will link you directly to the actual components class, which is hosted on GitHub. So it really is making this sort of design to dev handoff process a lot easier. Cool, next slide, please. So on the flip side of this, there's a whole bunch of new developer components to use for Android, iOS, web, and Flutter. These are all now found at github.com/material components, and then you can navigate from there to Android, iOS, web, Flutter. So for Android in particular, this is replacing the design support library. So the material design team is now in control of not only designing these components, but developing and shipping the code themselves. But you also get the full access to GitHub's issues. You can submit pull requests if you sort of stay within their guidelines. And hopefully it will speed up that process of getting new things out there and making sure that the actual components match the specs that they propose. There are a bunch of developer tutorials as well to get this done. Yeah, so there's a bunch of new cool components there. And next slide, please. Sweet, so I think that's me wrapping up. The idea here is just really they would like you to design and develop really cool things, things that are going to hopefully broaden the range of how Android apps look and behave, while still maintaining that the great material design feel, but I think really just allowing you to be expressive with your brand and whatever personality you want to work into your app. Cool, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Mike, and he's going to be talking about Polymer and PWAs.
Thanks a lot, Nick. There was so much awesome web stuff at I/O, but I was told that I had to choose one thing to present on. So I did the only reasonable thing and chose two instead. So I'm going to talk to you about Polymer and progressive web apps, some of the stuff that was announced at I/O. So if we go next, Polymer 3 was announced. And while it was no big secret, it was planned to be announced at I/O and released at I/O. It was still pretty awesome being there. So next. So one of the things that they did as a part of the talks there is they communicated the state of the project very, very well. Where they are, where they're headed, and why. And I think that the Polymer team has made no bones of their weirdness budget, which is basically their measure of how weird and different they can be and still have people adopt the framework. So as a part of the Polymer 3 release, they wanted to make it just a little bit less weird so that they can get more mainstream adoption, because they believe that web components are becoming mainstream now. So the first thing that they did is they cut down on as many polyfills as they could, because web component support is in most browsers and most mobile browsers particularly. And they could remove a whole bunch of stuff. The second thing that they needed to do was to move away from HTML imports, which weren't on a standardization path anymore. So they've now decided to move to standard JS imports for all of their stuff. Although there are some style trade-offs with Polymer 3 with that. So there is a little bit of a mismatch. The next thing that they wanted to do is, sorry, not next. is moved to NPM rather than Bower. And that's primarily because Bower is not active and really updated anymore. It's relatively defunct, and everything else on the internet is essentially on NPM. So the whole tone and message of Polymer 3 is to cut things down, make it more lean, and play nicely with others, and fit into existing tooling and approaches, and different paradigms that have become common on the web platform. So if we go next, they also shared their roadmap, their vision of what's forward for Polymer. So we've just discussed what made Polymer 3, but the big next steps are built off of last year's experiment with lit-HTML. Now, if you're not aware, lit-HTML is their super fast rendering library that fits into 3 kilobytes. That's heavily reliant on tag template literals. So that has essentially been built into their new base class, which is lit element, which uses the core property mixins of Polymer 3, includes lit-HTML, and essentially maxes out at about 5 kilobytes, which is really, really tiny for a full library. The next step past that is building on the material theming stuff that Nick's just mentioned, and working very, very closely with the material team to build a bunch of new material elements based off of material theming. It means that they're going to discontinue the paper elements that they've had previously, but it's really nice having official web component support. So the next step in the roadmap is something that they also presented on, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail in a moment, and that's the PWA starter kit. And past that, the view for the future is to continue on with more standards that will evolve the platform and take it to the next level. And this is where they're going to push on that weirdness budget again. So to push the web forward, the first thing that they want to do is they want to create something called CSS shadow parts, which will basically make it a lot easier to style web components, a lot more forgiving than the Shadow DOM is at the moment. The next thing is targeting the corporate client base and corporate adoptions in creating custom elements registries so that they can avoid conflicts of web components and larger applications. The next one, which is relatively important, is package name maps. And the reason why they want to do that is so that they can use the JavaScript imports with bare package modules like Node has, rather than using the fully qualified URL. And at the moment, there's tooling that the Polymer CLI uses to adjust that, but they want to make it a native platform feature because it's an emergent pattern. The next is HTML modules. And HTML modules is basically a new incarnation of HTML imports. HTML imports was not going to be standardized, and they decided not to fight against it, but rather to work with what is now JavaScript standard imports and give it a seamless way of working hand in hand and still let you import HTML into your application. The last one, which is a real big one and very, very speculative, is a problem that basically every front-end framework is trying to solve. And that's efficiently create and update HTML templates and push them to the DOM. So they've got some ideas as to how they can achieve that, particularly in context of it being platform native. And they're busy working, it's very, very early, but they're busy working closely with the Angular team, which is the other big framework in the stable, to try and come up with something that's going to be usable across the web. And I think there's some exciting stuff there. So if we go next, we can see one of the things that they announced, which was amazing, is the Polymer PWA starter kit. And it's a pretty cool one-stop shop for getting started with Polymer 3 and PWAs. So what it is it's based off of the new lit element that's still in preview. It's combining in Redux for state management in the application to show how to wire it in, as it's the de facto standard, and most applications are using that kind of unidirectional state flow. They've got testing set up in it by default, using web component test for unit testing and Puppeteer with screen capture for integration testing. They've got a whole bunch of small helpers that they've written to solve very, very common problems, such as routing and navigation and wiring in the Redux bits and pieces. And then a big aspect of it is they've got in this repository a whole bunch of samples. And the samples are, for example, a Hacker News client, flashcards using the speech recognition API, a book application to show which books have been read, and a simple e-commerce shop. And it's all awesome, and they all show different ways of cobbling the stuff together, maintained by the Polymer team. And all of the stuff is PWA by default. So it's got the manifest and service workers and purple pattern baked in. So this lets you get started with the stuff and show you how to fall into best practices. I'm super keen to kick the tires on this, and I've already started, and hopefully we'll be able to share more on that soon. So if we go next, building on the PWA aspect of it, there was a lot of awesome data and performance stuff that was discussed. A lot of education. This is how you figure out what is performant. This is how you analyze data, real user metrics. And I think one of the big announcements that came out of it is the Lighthouse 3 launch, where they've worked very, very closely with the Google UX team to build an updated, refined UI that has a whole bunch more audits, a faster feedback cycle, so the application itself is a lot faster. And something that's been a big problem is that every time you run it, it gives potentially wildly varying results in some cases. And this basically gives you a far smaller variance in audits with the new version. And while this will come with Chrome 69, which will be released, I think, July, they released the Lighthouse extension, which is a Google Chrome plugin that you can install 2 days ago. So you can go and kick the tires on that now and take a look at how you can make your website or your progressive web app better. If we go next, there were a whole bunch of web talks, so many. They've been collated in that playlist that you can go take a look at. And here are just a few of my favorite ones that I think are valuable to look through. And the last thing that I want to cover, if we can go next, is the theme of I/O, which was make good things together. And I really, really love the tone that set, because it's a simple and complex phrase where it's encouraging you to make things that are very, very good and solve problems that are worth solving, as well as make them well and work together as a community to build on it, which I thought was a lovely, lovely vibe. So I think from there, I'm going to hand over to Dario to finish us off with Android navigation components.
Hey, thank you, Mike, for the updates on PWA. Coming back to the Android realm, one of the most exciting things for me were the Android navigation components. Of course, they're part of a much larger group, a much larger set of libraries called Jetpack. And it comes with so many awesome things, but the Android navigation components were one of those that got my attention, and I'm really excited to explore and work with them. So basically, Android navigation components were created to kind of simplify the process of implementing navigation on Android. So if you've been developing Android apps, I'm pretty sure you had cases where you asked yourself what's the behavior your app should do when you press the up button or the system back button. So navigation component library comes with easy ways to implement that. And the way it does, we're going to see on the next slide. So the way it does pretty much allows you to define a navigation graph. And that navigation graph, you can set all your destinations on your app. And the interesting thing about this is that Google now is trying to push to have a model of a single activity application and have all your destinations being fragment. So it means that with architecture components, you will still develop your features, self-contained in fragments, write all the tasks necessary, and then you can drop those fragments into the navigation graph and create these connections that will actually show the specific flow that you want to take. So this is an example for one of the Google Talks. So if you have a quick trivia game where the start navigation is going to be the title screen, you can connect the register, the match, in-game, results, winner, and game over screens all together. And as you can see at the end of the game, you have two different screens. So for example, on the game over, you don't want the user to go back to the last question when the game is over. So the navigation component allows you to specify all that through this navigation editor in a very simple way. So I'm not going to go into details because I'm pretty sure there are a lot of questions out there from all these different topics, but I just wanted to make sure that this is something that everyone should take a look at, especially if you are starting to develop a new application. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Dale that's going to get us some questions from the audience.
Hey guys, if you've got any questions, be sure to ask in the chat on the talk. But I've got one for the panel. What's the most fun talk, or the most interesting talk, or the talk that surprised you the most while you were there? I didn't get to go in person. I was very envious of all you guys. So I'm just wondering what your big takeaway was.
One thing that I saw that I wanted to add to the slides, but we're a bit limited in time, was the Google Photos API. I'm not sure if everybody saw that talk. In fact, I watched it on the plane on the way back and fell asleep towards the end. So I don't know all the details of how it works or what it can do, but the possibilities seem pretty cool. You now have API access to Google Photos. So, I mean, you could find all the photos of your pets and then send them to something. I don't know. I'm sure there are more creative people out there than me, but the things you could do with the Google Photos API seem very cool. So that was definitely a highlight for me.
And from the web front?
So there was lots of cool stuff that happened on web, but I suppose one thing that surprised me was the ubiquity of the machine learning stuff. It's basically everywhere. One of the things that I didn't mention is that they announced a framework called Guess.js, which is basically using Google Analytics and machine learning to figure out which path you need to optimize for your users throughout the application and tell you what your bundle sizes should be. So I think that with the ML-Kit stuff that Josh presented show that machine learning is really, really becoming commoditized.
Yeah, for me, I had, I think, two other favorite talks that I enjoyed going to, but didn't get the chance to add them into the slides. So the one was a text talk. I can't think of what the name of the talk was, but it was by Florina and I think 2 or 3 other people. And basically they covered everything you need to know about text on Android. So it was really, really interesting and like a lot of content within that short amount of time. And then the other one that I really liked was this is a talk on building Android apps for Chrome OS. And they demonstrated like a bunch of different people doing different things on Chrome OS using from a guy, an illustrator from Marvel. He went up and drew Spider-Man on stage, which was really cool. And then someone else went and played some music on the Chromebook, which was also really interesting to watch.
Thanks, Rebecca. Got a question from the audience here, probably from Mike. Can PWA be used to develop serious applications that deal with a lot of document management?
Short answer, yes. Long answer, there are some limitations that you need to be aware of, and particularly cross-browser idiosyncrasies, like how much you can take offline and some of the APIs that are still available. But I think it definitely can deal with it. There are some very, very cool videos out there. I didn't go to the talk where they show taking a server-side rendered application like WordPress and building it as a PWA. So I think that there's a lot there. And then obviously, if you want to build on top of it as a dedicated platform, the answer is an emphatic yes.
Great,
do it.
And then another Android question. Are there any issues to be aware of when using MDC?
Cool, so I'll take that one. MDC being material design components. Yeah, so first of all, it's very new. So technically, the new material design components library, which is supposed to be replacing the design support library, is in alpha. So as usual with alpha libraries, try them out, but be aware that things are going to probably change. Secondly, you do need to have your compile SDK version set to Android P. So right now, that's not final yet. SDK 28 is still yet to be fully released, and the new version of Android as well. But you need to treat it as if it's almost as if you're using the support library 28 0.0.0 alpha 1. So you'll need to be compiling against that. But otherwise, I think it was used in, these components were actually used in the Google I/O 2018 app, which seemed to work pretty well. So I would say it's fairly safe to at least try out.
Cool, thanks, Nick. And then one last question. Single activity versus fragment. Which one to follow and why? So maybe Dario can answer that.
He's trying to say single activity.
I think Dario's on mute.
Yes, thanks, Dale. So as I was saying on the navigation section, so basically now Google is trying to push for this model where your application would have a single activity and then every other screen would be a fragment. So I personally believe that that might be the future, and it makes things very practical. So the way the navigation component works is that you define a navigation graph, as I showed that, and then that graph is going to be hosted into that activity, and that navigation fragment host is going to be responsible for handling the navigation for you. However, this works very well if you are starting a new app, so you can already have that mindset and have your designers, if you're on a team, to start thinking with that mindset. But if you are converting an existing app where you have different activities with multiple flows, the recommendation is that you take all of these flows and start creating you take all of these flows and create separate navigation graphs for them. And then once you more comfortable, you can start moving forward towards the one fragment activity, which if your application is very large, might be a very complicated thing to do.
Cool, thanks, Dario. And then we got a question from Osvaldo. I saw something about removing the Google domain from the AMP in the developer's keynote. Do you know of any roadmap or estimate of when that's going to happen? Anybody know about that?
No.
No? Okay, so no timelines have been announced. Okay. Sure.
That's cool.
Okay, there's one last one from Laurie. I really love Java. Would you guys definitely suggest Android developers to make their apps in Kotlin?
Rebecca, can you take that one?
I would say it's a strong yes from me. I mean, all the talks at Google I/O were in Kotlin, so I think there's a strong push from Google side to use Kotlin. Obviously, that doesn't mean go rewrite everything in Kotlin, but it's definitely, I've been writing it for a while and I'm enjoying it, so give it a try. They say that support for Java is still maintained, but they said the same thing about Eclipse a while ago, so who knows?
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. And thanks, everyone, for the fantastic questions. I'm going to hand over to Dario to do a quick wrap-up.
That's cool. Actually, before we wrap up, I/O was all this fun, a lot of talks, but I/O was pretty heavy, packed with a lot of talks during the day. But of course, there were so many fun things to do. So what were your highlights? What are the fun things that you did? Any funny memories? Any things to share? Go ahead, Rebecca. See, you had a lot of fun. Alex.
Yes, there was lots happening. So for those that haven't been to Google I/O, I think the most part about it is not just the talks. So the talks are one part of it, but there's just so much to see and do on all the nights of I/O. So the highlight for me was when watching some of my peers play sumo wrestling in gigantic Android suits. It was hilarious. There was just so much laughter and a lot of people playing and just a lot of fun. So that was the highlight for me.
That's cool. Alex, I see you were quite excited to share something.
The first night was a lot of fun with the wrestling, as Rebecca mentioned, and candy floss and all kinds of crazy things. The second evening was, I think some people would argue, even better. There was an amazing show put on by a couple of extremely good acts. And I think actually, Nick, it was your first I/O, and you might have earned a new nickname that night, if I understand correctly. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, these amazing music acts that you mentioned were actually legit amazing. The one act there was a group called Justice, who are from France, and like, I'm a very big fan, and I'm quite amazed that Google managed to bring them to I/O, which was really, really cool. And it was obviously a lot of fun. We danced, we sort of interacted with people we know, but also we met new people from Google and from elsewhere. I think Alex is referring to a nickname roughly derived from the shirt that I'm wearing, which includes a funny little logo of a sausage with a pizza hat on. So you can come and ask me about that later. But yeah, it was a good night. It was very fun, and it sort of it rounded off that whole I/O experience really well.
That's great. This was my third I/O, and the fun never stops. Like every I/O, like there's a lot of fun stuff to do. Like one of the highlights for me was learning how to do cotton candy. That was pretty cool. So that's it. If you want to know more about all these I/O stories, know more about the talks, and you have any questions, please feel free to hit up all of us on Twitter. We have our Twitter handles in the description of this video. So if you have any questions, and with this, we're actually on time to finish our show, and we hope to see you next month for a secret episode. So thank you for joining, everyone. See you around.